Join us for Reimagine Buildings 25, our global online conference this June 12th, or June 13th if you're in New Zealand, Australia, or Asia. This isn't just another event. It's a global gathering of the people building what's next. We're bringing together the doers, the visionaries, and the quietly revolutionary, those who are ahead of the curve in retrofits, new construction, and the future of low embodied carbon materials and climate positive building systems, past, present, future. From real world retrofit wins to high performance new builds to the boldest ideas in next gen materials. It's all here, one place, one time. And you won't just watch it happen, you'll be part of it as you connect with others on the same path. Show up, be inspired, and leave with clarity, momentum, and a community that has your back. Register for Reimagine Buildings 25 today, the conference where we reimagine what's possible and level up to build a future where we can thrive. Visit passivehouseaccelerator.com for more.
Architecture is this beautiful blend of science and art. For a long time, architects have tried to kind of get by sometimes on just the art side of it. If we don't get the science right, we live in a climate emergency. People are not going to be comfortable in these buildings. PHPP and Passive House just gives this really good tool for architects, and it doesn't limit their creativity. It just gives an extra kind of parameter to design within and feedback on what you're doing. So it makes it easier as an architect to get the optimum solution.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand. I'm joined this week by Zach Simke. How are you going, Zach?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. And we've also got with us Jay Fox. How are you doing?
Fantastic.
And Mary James, great to have you back on the podcast with us.
Nice to see you.
And Mary J, got a great update from Sarah Lewis from Scotland, who has been on the show and has been featured, Scotland and what's going on in the UK has been featured on the Passive House Accelerator several times, and some really exciting updates about what's going on in Scotland in general with their building code. And it was really great to get this update and some really interesting stuff about just the process to date. So we'll get stuck into that. But before we do that, Zach, we've got a few people to shout out to.
Indeed. Yeah, I want to start by thanking our sponsor of the week, European Architectural Supply, for supporting us and making everything we do here possible at the Passive House Accelerator, including the Passive House podcast. Thank you, too, to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thank you to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, European Architectural Supply, Facro, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, LG Air Conditioning Technologies, and Source 2050.
All right. Now, as I mentioned, Sarah Lewis has been featured on the Passive House Accelerator and on the podcast previously, so you can search those interviews and articles in the archives. But basically, there's some really exciting stuff going on in Scotland to do with introducing Passive House or near Passive House standard as part of the building code, which Sarah explains pretty well at the beginning of this interview to give us an update. So let's jump in and we'll have a bit of a catch up afterwards.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast. I'm Mary James, and I'm here with Jay Fox and Sarah Lewis, Research and Policy Director with Passivhaus Trust in the UK. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us today. And I want to talk about what's going on with the Scottish domestic building regulations. And just as a very brief background, in 2022, there was a bill introduced to require that all new residential construction in Scotland meet the Passivhaus standard or a Scottish equivalent. And this was like this super exciting development. And there have been some ups and downs since. So, could you kind of give us a little bit of background and lead us up to what's happening now?
Absolutely. So yeah, we've had some really exciting kind of policy movements right across the UK actually over kind of recent years. And it kind of, I think, ties into the bigger kind of drive towards getting to net zero buildings that we have right across the globe. And as part of that, Scotland ran a climate assembly. So this was an assembly of people that were brought together, just regular citizens. The idea with the climate with the citizens assembly is that they are across kind of a cross sector of society, covering a diverse range of people, and they come up with recommendations to government on how to tackle difficult issues. So this one was, how do you have a just transition to net zero? And they came up with this idea that all new buildings should be passive house or equivalent, or sort of Scottish equivalent, within a short time frame. So one of the Scottish MSPs, so the members of Parliament, took this forward as a bill to the government to say we should do this. So that is what you're referring to. So that was like December 2022. The Parliament effectively debated the issue. They agreed at that point to make subordinate legislation within 2 years to introduce this minimum environmental design standard for all new buildings. um, all new housing, but they are expanding this to all new buildings to meet a Scottish equivalent to the Passive House standard. So it was all very exciting. And that took us to basically Christmas just gone, when they did pass some legislation to make sure there was nothing effectively preventing them introducing this new minimum standard. So they kind of met that target, but we've not seen any legislative regulatory change yet. So small legislative changes, but it's not yet translated into the regulation changes is what we need, because that's what everybody needs to comply with when delivering buildings. So after that period, at the end of last year, there's been continuous working groups. We had a big consultation over the summer, last summer, about what the standards should look like as a kind of general principles. There was various working groups that the Passivhaus Trust are part of, really digging down into what this might mean for different building typologies, so not just housing, but also non-domestic buildings. And at the end of last year, the working group, which includes housing developers, contractors, suppliers, academics, other industry professionals, came together with a consensus report. And the consensus report's really fantastic because it brought together these very disparate opinions into a consensus, and the consensus largely agreed with all of the key points that the Passivhaus Trust had about what would make a true Passivhaus equivalency for Scotland. So that was very good. And then that brings us to this year, when we have continued with the working groups with Scottish Government, with the idea that we are trying to refine down the key kind of sticking points around what this Scottish Passivhaus equivalency could be, leading up to a big consultation this summer on the finer points, at the end of which we should know what the Scottish Passivhaus equivalent is, and then it would be looked at being implemented in 2026, potentially as a voluntary standard, then maybe building up to a mandatory standard. The timescale will be part of this next round of consultation, although there was reference to it in the first consultation of this kind of 2026 implementation, but in a voluntary way, becoming mandatory by 2028. So that kind of like set the regulation in motion so that everybody sees the direction of travel. Then industry can invest appropriately. You have this transition period where projects can meet the new standard, but don't have to, as everybody gets ready. And then by a certain cutoff date, all projects will have to have transitioned to delivering to that higher standard. And that, although it feels drawn out, makes it feel a lot more doable. It's very pragmatic and practical. So it's something that we would certainly support, especially when you look at maybe some of the sticking points being things around supply chain issues. So you're like, we need to give the confidence to the supply chain to upskill and increase capacity to be able to deliver these buildings. So it was quite a long answer to the to the question.
No, that's fantastic though. And I actually have, just continuing that line of, with scaling and upskilling. I mean, what's the current state of kind of high performance building in Scotland, or I guess the UK in general? I know it's very patchy in the US. Certain states are a lot better and further along than others. Do you think that there's already kind of this, it's familiar enough that it can be adopted in time?
I feel like it is. I mean, I am the optimist, so I always have an optimistic outlook on these things, but I absolutely think this is doable. I don't think anything that's being suggested is too out there. It feels like it's building on what we already do. We already have pretty robust building regulations and building standards around the UK. And this is just like another layer of development to that system. In Scotland, I mean, there's different ways to build. And in Scotland, primarily, it's timber construction for new build housing. But when you move to England, it's more likely to potentially be block and brick. So there's different building systems. The Scottish timber supply chain is very mature. They're very well set up to deliver these projects. It's just an adaptation effectively of what they're already doing. So I think one of the great things about Passivhaus is a lot of the time what we're saying is, you know what, the U values you're already doing are pretty good. The components you're using in these buildings are pretty good. It's pretty close to Passivhaus. The main changes are like a change in methodology, a reduction of this performance gap, which is rife in our industry, and quality assurance as like this kind of golden thread that follows a project from inception right through to completion. And so if we can get those kind of principles of approach together and into building regulations, then the actual physical parts of building the building, things we think of like insulation, air tightness, windows, MVHR, thermal bridging, that is already being done. And certainly like the large contractors, like our tier one contractors, already have fantastic quality assurance processes that they can just adapt to a slightly new delivery method with Passivhaus. And we've had some really positive experience in Scotland already through the schools delivery program, which is a bit of a precursor to all of this, where the funders for schools in Scotland decided to set a performance metric for performance in use. So they said, we'll give you capital funding for these schools, but getting that capital funding is contingent on 25 years of monitoring. And if your building is underperforming in terms or using too much energy, so for every couple of kilowatt hours extra it's using in energy, you get a percentage or two less of funding. So suddenly these schools estates were looking around and being like, well, how are our current projects performing against design targets? And performance gaps were 200%, 500%. They're like, oh, we're not going to get the funding. So to secure that, the tier one contractors and the clients sort of looked to Passivhaus as a sort of guaranteed way to effectively eliminate that performance gap. So there's already this great example in Scotland of going from 0 Passivhaus schools, which we had in mid 2024, we still had none, to like 35 schools being planned around Scotland aiming for the Passivhaus standard, which was just crazy. The first of which have been completed, are now winning all the design awards because they're performing really well. The students love them, the teachers love them, the air quality is great. So it's been a great kind of example to, I think, Scottish government about how well it can go and how quickly actually the industry just will adapt. And the feedback from those tier one contractors has been really fantastic as well. With the funders, Scottish Futures Trust, were saying that across some of the Passivhaus sites, the mental health has been reported to be better because people are delivering better buildings, they feel better about it. It's just like lots of good news stories around the school program in Scotland. So
it's great to have that track record. I know that Passivhaus Trust has been involved a lot in trades training to kind of establish the ground base of people who understand how to move forward to build Passivhaus compliant buildings, which is so necessary. And it reminds me a little bit of Vancouver, British Columbia with their Step 5 code, where they've been able to tell the industry, this is where we're going. And so it's not this big, scary hurdle.
Absolutely. I think you're right though. It's like you have to tell the industry where you're going. And I think uncertainty is like the blocker to all of these things. Because being the optimist I am, in 2022, when the government said we're going to make this legislation, all new buildings have to be passive house, I thought suddenly every single passive house training spot would be fully booked for 5 years into the future. We would just be inundated with everybody needing to like learn about the stuff. Suppliers would be falling, but it doesn't work like that, it turns out. You need the legislation to come first to give the industry the guarantee that that is the way things are moving. What they don't want to do is invest in something and then the government backtracks, things don't move forward, and it's been a wasted investment. So we need leadership from our governments to, or from the local government. If you've got local government regulations like you have in the States, you need that leadership to really drive these projects forward. Having said that, there's always people in the industry wanting to drive forward in advance of legislation, and maybe it's the conversations that make them think, well, let's get ahead of this, and they have some confidence that they should go ahead and do it. I don't know, did you hear about the big news out of the UK last week? I don't know if you guys have heard. Our largest developer, Barratt Homes, have just announced that all the flats that they will deliver in London will now be Passive House certified. And they're looking to expand that to all the social housing that they deliver in the capital. So this is like the largest developer in the UK. And this comes on the back of Cairn Homes, who are the largest developer in Ireland, announcing that they would deliver all their units Passive House certified last year. So there already is a swell in the private development sector now, which is new in the UK, because previously a lot of the big projects were coming through as social housing, which is the term we use in the UK for sort of government funded housing. So those projects, there's a clear reason why those clients are looking to Passive House, because they want to make sure their residents aren't in fuel poverty. They want to make sure that they're delivering really good quality homes for their residents. So historically, people on lower incomes often have poorer quality homes, and there can be problems with health and well-being and mold and condensation, all these things. So the idea that they could have housing programs which were delivering these really high quality homes met a lot of their requirements. Plus, because they keep ownership of those homes, the higher quality components, the more careful construction, all of that is a real bonus for them. Whereas with the developers, they're building a product effectively to sell at a profit, and they don't get to retain anything really from the quality. So it's really remarkable and amazing that we've got to a point now where actually it makes commercial sense for these big developers actually to also be making the leap into Passive House certification.
All of that is fantastic news, and I love that you just threw in the mental health component as well, because I mentioned earlier before the interview that I was on the West Coast, and I was there because I was at the American Psychiatric Association's annual meeting, and the social determinants of health, poor housing, were starting to gain a bit more recognition there. So it's great to hear that it's happening in the UK and Scotland. I guess getting into more details about the actual Scottish equivalent, like what I'm curious what the actual like difference between the Scottish equivalent and like the standard from the Passive House Institute would technically be.
Yeah, so the most fundamental difference is going to be that the Scottish Passive House equivalent has to be certified or verified through the Scottish building standards. So we are not looking at having full third-party Passive House Institute accreditation for all of our buildings. We had lots of discussions with the Passive House Institute around this, and they as well are really supportive of local governments or national governments certifying buildings to basically the building physics of the Passive House standard without it having to be through the Institute, which makes sense when you're doing it at the kind of scale that you would need to then do it if it's national regulation. So that's the biggest fundamental difference. we're expecting, and it looks very likely, it was in the consensus report, it got very positive feedback in the first round of consultation. So we're expecting that any certified passive house buildings will obviously just be deemed to satisfy the Scottish building standards and effectively get a pass through that section of the regulations. So there will be no need to do a second set of energy calculations. So that is really key, and that's great. So we know that full certification, and it's not confirmed yet, but it just, everything indicates to that being in place as part of this new standard. The other thing we're pretty confident is this transition period. So we're expecting something to come in relatively quickly, say for next year, but that there's going to be this transition. The other pieces that kind of for us are like our really strong recommendations, and we want to see these in because we feel like if we don't get these things in, it would be very difficult for us to say, yes, this is a passive house equivalent standard. So at the moment, we have like notional buildings where there's not like a specific energy target for a building. It's based on like a notional specification. I think it's similar actually in the States, the way that the buildings are modeled for compliance. So we would like to see an energy use intensity metric, so in kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum. So probably rather than primary energy, just go for energy use intensity, which would mean that the energy on the design matched the user's bills. So a really easy way for people to kind of check up on their project. We would like PHPP to be an accepted compliance modeling tool, even if you're not going for passive house certification. That is challenging in the sense that we would need to get skilled up people within the current system of the Scottish Building Standards certification process. So either through Scottish Government or through their kind of contracted verifiers. So they're called Section 6 verifiers. So we'd need to get them, and a lot of them actually already are passive house trained. So that doesn't seem like too big a bar, but it would mean that you had two tools in the standards, which is not something they've had previously. So we don't know whether that will go through. Those are the main things. We would like to see a peak heat load metric in there rather than just having space heating demand. We would like to see space heating demand, of course, but we would like the option for the peak heat load metric because we see that used a lot in Scotland. We have, less solar radiation in Scotland than in other parts of the UK. And having the peak heat load metric makes it easier to rotate a project. So for housing developers, to have like a model house type that they know works in various orientations, using that metric is useful for that. What else? So that was I think those are the main things that we're kind of looking for. I think the piece around absolute metrics can't be kind of highlighted enough. I think that's a fundamental difference from the way regulations have worked before, where it's been this notional approach. But it aligns with people like Letty in the UK, REBA, so our Royal Institute of British Architects, the BRE, SIBSI, RICS, the UK Green Building Council. Like everybody agrees that absolute metrics are necessary if you want to see the kind of change that we're looking for. So we really hope that recommendation will be taken forward.
Yeah, in California, we have a similar campaign going on to try and allow for to use the PHPP and as an alternate compliance method. And it would make such a big difference because having to energy model the two different ways is a real barrier. And yeah, getting to use the PHPP, especially for practitioners who are already used to that, would be, again, lowering the barriers significantly for them. So I can see how
Absolutely.
that would be
Also,
hugely helpful.
absolutely. It's also a design tool. And at the moment, the tools we have are compliance tools. So they're very different. For regulation, it's literally you're kind of ticking some boxes at the end of the process, whereas PHPP is something you're bringing in at REBA stage 2 during concept design, and you're testing things out and you're using it to do real value engineering when you're looking at the value of different design choices and whether they make sense. And you're seeing the real time energy implications of those things. My background's as an architect, and I mean, architecture is this beautiful blend of science and art. And I think that for a long time, architects have tried to kind of get by sometimes on just the art side of it. And it's like, if we don't get the science right, we live in a climate emergency. It's like people are not going to be comfortable in these buildings. Like PHPP and Passivhaus just gives this really good tool for architects, and it doesn't limit their creativity. It just gives an extra kind of parameter to design within and feedback on what you're doing. So it makes it easier as an architect to get the optimum solution because you've got some really good pragmatic, factual feedback. You've got the data basically to help you with your decision making.
Yeah, really good point.
Okay. Well, I want to change gears just a little bit because you did mention that about the I guess it was like the Scottish People's Council, or I forget exactly what you call that.
Citizens Assembly.
Citizens Assembly, which is a wonderful name. And I'm just kind of curious why, because in the US there is let's call it reluctance to kind of embrace climate change as reality. Within Scotland, there seems to be more acceptance of that and a willingness to do something about it. And I'm just curious, what culturally, what do you kind of attribute that to?
Well, that's a good question.
It's a really theoretical question. Sorry, but I've always been curious.
I feel like for with the citizens assemblies, one of the things that the government had said in response to this was that it gave them a mandate to effectively act on some of the really difficult things that need to be decided, and maybe make decisions which aren't ones which they would have had the confidence to go ahead and make without the backing of the assembly. So it's like the assembly were like, we should just do this. And actually, when you say to people, just general citizens, like, would you like healthier housing that costs you less to run, that is more comfortable to live in, and will mean you have a healthier family? It's like, why would anyone vote against that? So
Yeah.
when you take out the lobbying, the industry, the vested interests, all that stuff, the supply chain, that's not what people are interested in. It's like, would you like better quality homes? People are like, yes. So effectively, that gave that mandate, and then Scottish government were like, okay, well, how can we deliver on this recommendation from that citizens assembly? Why we have citizens assemblies and how they function, I suppose, like, I don't know the history of that. I know that it's actually slightly different even in the UK. So in Scotland, our government has a requirement to respond to a citizens assembly, and I don't think it's the case universally in the UK. I think I'm correct in saying that. So they do have more gravitas in Scotland, and we are, I don't know, we're a small country, so sometimes that can make it easier because there's sometimes less, I don't know, you can get to the people you need to speak to who make these decisions in a slightly easier way. I remember first, going over to Austria and Germany and places to look at Passivhaus in like 2002 when I was a student. And I'd gone to Wolleberg in Austria, and it was like this hotbed of all this Passivhaus stuff because somebody had gone into the municipal government who was a Passivhaus designer and architect and could make changes. And it was one of the smaller districts. So they made quite rapid changes quite quickly. And then that, could spread around. So hopefully Scotland making these moves as well will mean that it will influence the sort of bigger nations as well. I mean, we also have other areas like Wales, which is within the UK, and the Welsh government has a project called the Tair Arcade, which is a pattern book for social housing, and they've got something like 23 or 24, maybe a few more social housing providers to come together and develop this pattern book that they will then deliver on all of their sites if they want to. They have the option to. And there's two standards within the pattern book. One is the AACB, which sits just under Passivhaus, and the other one is Passivhaus, both of which use PHPP.
Oh.
So that's been a really interesting project to see as well. So while it's not regulation in Wales, there is this group of clients looking to use it again in that social housing sector where they're delivering homes which are going to relieve people from fuel poverty and all the associated passive house benefits for social housing. So that's a really exciting program as well. So we're seeing things all around the country kind of starting.
And I'm curious, I want to talk a little bit more about the supply chain, because one of the you brought up that the major housing developer, sorry, I've forgotten. I know it's Cairns in Ireland, but I've forgotten the name here in
It's
London.
Barrett
Barrett.
Housing.
Uh, are pledging to deliver 100% passive house. And I understood from one of your recent webinars that 1% of the new construction in the UK is meeting passive house, which is such an amazing statistic. But I was wondering if how you feel the supply chain delivering the components that are essential to creating passive house buildings. Is it living up to supplying all these new buildings? And also, has Brexit changed that at all? Because, don't some of the products come from the EU and maybe aren't manufactured there?
Yeah, I mean, so as we've seen the scaling up of the delivery, we are also seeing the scaling up of the supply chain. The UK does manufacture certain components which are used within passive house buildings, but we don't manufacture all of them. So there's definitely scope for us to invest more in manufacturing in the UK and be able to use this as a kind of way to kickstart some good innovative local businesses and things. In the meantime, certain things are imported. So MVHR units is one of those ones. There are
But sorry,
really
I
good
just want to jump in and say MVHR for our audience is mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, what we would call HRVs. So
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So yes, so the MVHRs often are imported from our continental European neighbours. And there's companies in the UK who import those units and maintain them and service them and design, install, commission, all that kind of stuff. So we have quite a good framework within the UK, but the actual products are imported. The question around Brexit, I mean, both Brexit and the war in Ukraine had a really big impact on overall construction in the UK. It affected things like timber pricing, it affected components that were being brought across. But that's not a specific passive house problem, if you know what I mean. That was just like an industry wide, there was an impact on the construction industry. So certain things like insulation and timber prices went up quite significantly, but that affects all projects, not just passive house projects. Um, and I don't think that the expectation is that the prices would necessarily come back down, but I think they have probably plateaued. So I think people are sort of more confident in pricing projects. And I've not heard specifically of supply chain problems, say, for example, in the Scottish schools delivery program, where there's all these projects going forward. That's not to say that there might be some I haven't heard about, but I haven't heard specifically about there being challenges around that. And when it comes to things like window suppliers, there's so many window suppliers of passive house windows in the UK. When it comes to membranes, we're already using air tightness products. So that's not necessarily a change. The change with passive house is that they need to be installed to a much higher quality and the tapes need to be really good so that we know they're not going to fail. What else is there? I mean, I think I suppose that's one of the things about passive house. The components that make this building are very similar to components that are making a non-passive house project. They might just be a slightly higher quality. So if we're already importing something, we might have to import a slightly higher quality version.
Just playing on that, we're seeing the adoption of more, I guess, like let's call them natural building supplies for specifically like insulation, with either hemp or straw or even wool, but I don't know how common that is yet. I'm just curious, are you seeing the similar kind of adoption in the UK and in Scotland, or is that still kind of in its nascency at this point?
We have quite a complex landscape at the moment in terms of natural materials in the UK. So when it comes to passivhaus projects, a lot of the pioneer projects were delivered with natural materials because the people who adopt very low energy buildings first were also adopting natural materials. So it's not actually until you get the kind of passive house at scale that we started to see more of the higher embodied materials popping up,
Mm.
because it was a cheaper way to get that low U value to use these higher embodied energy materials. However, having said that, we had a fire in the UK in a tower block in London, which resulted in something called the Grenfell inquiry. And as a result of the Grenfell inquiry, the requirements on the fire performance of insulation products that are used in buildings is much more stringent than it was pre-Grenfell. And that is making it difficult in some instances to use more natural materials. So it's not to say it's not possible, but they have to be fire tested to a level that they weren't typically being fire tested to. So it has meant that some products are not being used, which we were seeing being used before when around those sort of natural materials. So it's a kind of moving picture in the UK, and obviously everybody in the UK was reeling after the Grenfell disaster, and any legislation which was there to kind of tighten up fire performance of products is something that everybody really supports. So it's just looking at how we can make sure that within that we have low embodied carbon materials so that we can reduce the upfront carbon of the buildings as well.
Yeah, I think that Grenfell, just how wide of an impact it had. I believe even in New York, they passed local laws kind of restricting prefabricated assemblies, like you can't have empty space between it, like that needs to be filled with rated material. I forget the name of that legislation. It's like local law 120 or something. So I guess we focused on new construction quite a bit, but I'm curious with retrofits. Is this kind of new standard going to apply to retrofits for larger buildings or all residential buildings? Because I know it might be kind of stressful for, a single family owner to retrofit to passive house standards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we don't have very significant building regulation requirements for retrofit sort of projects unless you're really like stripping back the building and then there's a requirement to do some work. So no, there's no intention at this point in time that this is going to extend to retrofit projects. I mean, we in Scotland we recently had a requirement for all homes. So this was like national legislation for all homes to install like wired smoke detectors, fire alarms. And these were, I think the cost on average was about £200, and this would save the life of your family if there was a fire in your house. And this caused absolute national outrage, that people were being made to do this very expensive thing to their buildings. So retrofit is obviously on a completely different level, and we're not able to say that when you spend this money, you're going to save the life of your family. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to work out what mechanisms are the best to support people in doing those retrofit works to their buildings. And you know, I have opinions on how it could be done, but nothing that has been discussed with Scottish government. So, I feel like at point of sale, you could easily have a requirement for homes to be at a certain energy level in the kind of energy performance certificates. And if it's not at that level, the building gets assessed at point of sale anyway, so there would be a cost to get to that level, and then that gets subtracted from the sale, or the person does it before they sell. So there would be a way to add that in, that I feel like feels reasonable, but I'm not a politician, and I am probably too optimistic about how easy these things are to do. So I should also say that I did I'm very close to EnerPHitted my own home. So I'm in my very near EnerPHit right now, and it is a huge amount of work and it's very challenging, and it would be very difficult to get all the buildings retrofitted to this kind of level of performance. So I think we also have to be realistic about our expectations. Um, realistic about what we need. And I think a lot of what we need is we need to reduce the demand at peak time on the grid. So that's your kind of demand reduction in buildings. So that's those buildings which can be retrofitted relatively easily. We should target those. All the new builds need to not add to this peak heat load issue, which means that we need to have Passivhaus level of performance for new builds. So that's a very positive thing, because those buildings effectively can draw from the grid at any time, which makes them kind of flexible assets from that kind of government energy framework point of view. And then we need to focus on making sure that we can transition people from gas to air source heat pumps or other heat pumps, because electricity is expensive in the UK, which again is another thing which I'm not quite sure why it's so expensive. We need to bring the cost of electricity down. We need to transition people from gas to heat pumps or other electric heating. And we need to make sure people aren't in damp, cold, moldy homes. So there's like various things that are like non-negotiables. And if we could do all of that, we'd be in a much better position, and we'd still be a long way off a nation full of EnerPHit projects, but we'd have made a big difference to the kind of quality of people's lives inside their homes and buildings as well. So yeah, there's some great work around that, I think, all around the globe, with like the Outfit project from the Institute and various local initiatives that I hear about. So I think people are trying really hard to find the solutions to decarbonising building stock, but it's not an easy one to tackle.
I wanted to ask you about, so with the Scottish equivalent that's being considered, is there anything in the legislation that requires or even implies adopting all electric buildings for these new to be in line with the requirements that you're considering, that are being
Yes, I'm gonna give myself a slap on the wrist for not giving you I should be able to give you the accurate answer to this. Scotland already banned fossil fuels from, I want to say the end of this is what I should know. I want to say it was from the end of this year, somewhere around 2025. We basically shouldn't be doing it already or shortly. But we had in Scottish Government a power sharing agreement between the Scottish National Party and the Green Party called the Butte House Agreement. The Butte House Agreement collapsed last year, and that fossil fuel buildings was part of the Butte House Agreement. So that is why I'm not entirely sure where gas fits now. I'm not quite sure whether we now are still allowed it or whether it's still, anyway. With the Passivhaus equivalent, I would like to think that will be all, they'll be all electric. We do have a very good level of wind energy in Scotland. I can attest to that because I live on the coast and it's just always blowing a gale. But also I look out my window and I just see like rows of offshore wind turbines. We have really invested in wind energy in Scotland, and we export wind energy now to other parts of the UK. So we generate a lot of wind energy here. So we should go all electric, that's for sure.
And fuel poverty is also, you mentioned that, and I just wanted to bring that up again because I imagine that it's part of the impetus behind even considering these new building regulations. Because please help me out here, but as I understand, fuel poverty is higher in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's correct. By a significant margin as well. We have really high fuel poverty in Scotland for various social economic reasons, and also the fact that we are further north than the rest of the UK, and it is colder and windier and wetter in Scotland. So our buildings have to work harder to give the same level of comfort, or not, just to keep people warm. So yes, we have a bigger percentage of the population living in fuel poverty, which absolutely has factored into the government being so supportive of a significant uplift in the building standards. There's also, there's been various, like, there was the Grenfell disaster in Scotland. There was this issue which also led to some of the school's clients going passive house. There was this issue with these walls of school. Basically, a wall fell off a school into the playground. No children were in the playground at the time, but it turned out to be like a construction building issue to do with like how the bricks were tied at the top of the wall. It turned out that it had been repeated on other sites, so it became this really big issue. So there's also this incentive to use these systems which just have this higher quality assurance built into them to address wider construction industry issues. And when you go to these sites, it is a step change. It's like the sites are tidier, there is more care being put into things. People are really conscious of getting the details right. They know things are being checked. They know an air pressure test is coming, so they want to get it right rather than sort of covering up things or getting it to them the fastest way they can. So I think I've gone off topic a bit. Can't remember if I'm actually answering the question anymore.
No, it is sort of the incentives for why the Scottish government is seriously
Yes, okay.
considering these updated building regulations. But I also
Yes, yeah.
you brought up living in Scotland. I don't know what part of Scotland, but I just picked up a novel that I was reading called The Outrun. Have you ever heard of it?
I do not know The Outrun. Where is it based?
It does take place mostly in the Orkneys, and the constant weather, and talk about uncomfortable buildings that sort of show up
Yeah.
in this novel.
So yes. So I'm based in like the Central Belt, which is the very kind of very quite low down in Scotland. So not that far from England. So I'm just east of Edinburgh. So you've got the big cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and I'm in that zone. But my grandparents were from Shetland, and actually speaking with social housing providers, there's a provider up in Shetland who said before all this passive house stuff, they were like airtightness, 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 because otherwise you just sit in the building and the wind just blows the heat straight out and you watch it whiz out the window. So they're like, we were already doing airtightness. So the difference is like they have to add in some way to make sure you've got high quality ventilation. So that's where passive house really adds to what they were able to deliver anyway, because when you're already doing airtightness, then you just need to sort out the ventilation. They were already doing pretty good levels of insulation, again, because it's so cold. But there were some issues around things like condensation on windows. And that's because once you've got a building airtight, you've got more condensation that's being held in the building when you don't have effective ventilation. So that's why that ventilation part is so important. And it's definitely going to be one of the trickiest bits to get right in the regulation, because one of the things about setting regulation is you can't set like one way to meet it. It needs to be open enough that there's different ways that you can meet this new building standard, basically. And it's very difficult to find a way to deliver good quality ventilation unless you use like a balanced ventilation system, which basically means MVHR, or ventilation with heat recovery. So it's really difficult to meet that requirement. And at the moment, the Scottish regulations say that if your airtightness is less than 5, you have to provide some level of mechanical ventilation already. So we're talking about going much lower than that, and then we'd want it to be mandated that it was a balanced supply and extract system, so we know we're getting the level of air quality we need. So I think navigating that with the industry is certainly going to be one of the challenges of the second round of consultation.
Well, we're really looking forward to seeing how this goes, as I imagine you are too. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come in and talk with us about it. It's great, and it's so inspiring, I just want to say, for other jurisdictions. Like, I can only hope that California is paying some attention as we struggle to get our Energy Commission here in the state to consider adopting Passive House as an alternate compliance pathway. It's very inspiring to watch what you guys are doing.
I mean, I have to say, we also have been very outward looking in this process. So we've looked at what's happening in Massachusetts, for example, in the States, with the optional sort of upgrade to regulations, what's been happening in Vancouver. So I think everyone is trying to share the knowledge to make it a compelling case for those policymakers, because we are asking for a leap of faith based on data and 30 years of research and blah, blah, blah. But it's like we need to kind of work together to create these solutions which are palatable at that kind of political national level.
And I guess I just want to ask on that note one final question with like what advice would you have for like building a coalition of kind of stakeholders, whether it's builders, architects, engineers, everybody. How do you kind of get everyone on the same page to make this like concerted effort to push the government?
You need to have a citizens' assembly. That's what you need to do.
Okay. So direct democracy in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I, you know, over years I've been like, oh, maybe the industry will get there on their own. And then you watch the progress is not being made, and you see the same terrible quality when you look around being constructed. And I'm at the point where I'm like, no, we need legislation. This has to be driven by people with some ambition at the very top who are making the legislation to drive meaningful change at the kind of pace and scale that we absolutely need as a globe to make sure that we can all still be here enjoying these buildings in decades to come. So, yeah, absolutely. I think it needs to come from the legislators.
And that was Sarah Lewis from the Passivhaus Trust in the UK, telling us, giving us the update about exciting progress in Scotland. Let's go to you first, Mary. What was your highlights there?
Well, just the moving ahead, and that legislation is the way to really get the industry moving forward, I thought was a great highlight. And of course, we see this also in Massachusetts, for instance, or in British Columbia. So it's not the first time we've seen this, but it's exciting.
Definitely. How about you, Jay?
Well, 2 points. One was not totally relevant, but the Barrett London deciding that they're going to only build to Passivhaus standards, I thought was a pretty huge little tidbit that Sarah threw out there. The other was about mental health, which I thought was great that she said that, people who are in these buildings already are, just really ecstatic about them. They really enjoy them, and they feel that their mental health is better, which is, of course, my one thing I'm very interested in. So I just love hearing that. And also her discussion about schools, which I spoke with Anne-Marie Fallon last year about that. And it's just like, it's amazing what's happening in Scotland. I think it's really like a good case study in how you can actually create this legislation and get it to work.
Yeah. Yeah, I picked up on, I thought she made the comment about the mental health, the builders also being more proud, which is massive because we have a shockingly high rate of suicide in the construction industry here in New Zealand, which is just terrible, and also the other mental health issues associated with that. So having people build stuff that they enjoy doing and is fulfilling, I think is massive. And Passivhaus definitely facilitates that. Zach?
It was good for my mental health to hear hear the stories.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really the kind of the positive feedback loops with positive outcomes was really great to hear about around the schools, with the clean air, the awards, the happy people, and as in the occupants, the happy practitioners. And going back to Barrett, I think, and the incredible progress that's happening in policymaking in Scotland, and it sounds like elsewhere in the UK too. There's this important relationship between the market, what's happening voluntarily, and how that can lay the groundwork for these major legislative accomplishments and progress. And it is really exciting to have developers who aren't going to hold on to a building decide that they're just going to do passive house, and that they're at a place where the market understands what passive house is enough to basically properly value the better quality of those buildings. And I think it bodes well for the potential to do that in more and more places, including here in the United States and in these different states. And I was sharing population numbers. It was very gracious of Sarah to nod to Massachusetts and New York and what's going on there. And also, I would encourage people to take that seriously, because when you look at the population numbers, Scotland is 5 million, and that's 5.5 million, very similar to Massachusetts, which I think is 7 million. So the impacts that we can make at the sub-national level, as they say here in the U.S., are still very important, and it's important for us to remember that at a time when we're not going to be making progress around climate and buildings at the federal level.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that that it's an achievable scale to think of a state the size of Massachusetts, and that's very similar size of the population, but also the size of industry. You talked a little bit about the supply chain question there, Jay. So it was really, definitely transferable. A couple of things that I picked up on top of all of the things that you guys have pointed out. Using PHPP and energy modeling in general as a design tool, not just a compliance tool. And that's something I'm really pushing in the industry here in New Zealand at the moment, is to think of energy modeling as a really useful design tool for actual value engineering, not just an excuse to get rid of things and then to get a certificate at the end for compliance, but using it's so valuable for design to actually get better performance. And then she mentioned about Wales and the social housing organisations coming together to produce what she called a pattern book. And I love that idea, because the other thing that really I see a lot happening, and it's a big inefficiency in the industry, is a lot of reinventing of the wheel of designers just coming to this very similar outcomes and spending a lot of time and clients' money kind of reinventing stuff. So I really like the idea of a pattern book, or hesitant to call them standard designs after my conversation with Sharon Robinson from last week, but having some form of starting point of designs that are known to work, along with a set of specifications for particular climate zones, so that that those things don't have to be continually reinvented. Some really, really cool stuff. I was going to ask you, you mentioned it there, Zach and Jay, a little bit about what we can take from this journey that's taken place over, I think, a fairly short period of time. I mean, this has happened relatively rapidly if you consider the degree of change. I don't know, Jay or Mary, what are there sort of some main takeaways that we could learn from the Scottish example and translate that to other jurisdictions?
Well, I just have to jump in here and say, yes, what you were saying, I didn't even realize. I mean, I'd heard about the schools in Scotland being, if they wanted funding, they have to meet passive house requirements, which of course is a great way to get compliance with that. But that it was as recently as 2024 that there were no passive house schools, and now there's 35 that are either completed or in the works in Scotland because of the funding mechanism. So that's
and it's not that they've mandated passive house, it's that they've geared the funding for the operational expenses. Was that right?
Yes. Well, it's funding for the schools. I don't know if it's limited to operational expenses, but or whether, I believe that it's also to help pay back the construction costs.
Right.
But basically, it was in response to being this huge performance gap where schools were being built and they were supposedly energy efficient, but the reality after they were built was that they were not comfortable and they were not energy efficient. And by requiring Passive House, they're now actually getting what they're paying for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And
Do you have anything to add, Jade?
just the idea of kind of putting legislation first as a way to kind of pull people along. I do know that I was thinking of Local Law 97 in New York. A lot of landlords kind of were holding out, thinking that there was no way that the city was actually going to do this and fine everyone, and kind of one of those like a bunch of 10-year-olds getting together, like they can't give us all detention. Yeah, turns out they can. So as Sarah said, she's eternal optimist, and she thought people would be jumping on go to these training sessions to learn about Passive House the second that the legislation even came up, and it wasn't really happening. And I see the same thing with Local Law 97. When that was proposed, a lot of landlords weren't really acting and owners weren't really acting, and I think that's starting to change now. So once things get enacted, you really get the ball moving. So I think that's maybe a universal lesson that we need to learn.
And let's give a shout out also to Passivhaus Trust and Sarah Lewis for their excellent work to help make this happen. I mean, I think that's been no small part of the reason that we're talking about this. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Great stuff. Thank you for bringing us that update, Jamie. Really good to stay in touch with what's going on over there, because it is a really positive story, and I think there's lots of transferable stuff there which we can all take encouragement from. Zach, what do we got coming up over at the Accelerator?
Yeah, at the Accelerator this week, we have a 101 edition of Passivhaus Accelerator Live on Wednesday, June 4th, and we're going to be joined by my good friend Dan Whitmore here, Fias Builders trainer and longtime Passive House practitioner and leader based in Seattle. And so he's going to be talking about small-scale residential passive house and passive building. So please join us for that. And then the big news is that we have on June 12th, Reimagine Buildings 25, Past, Present, Future, our big global online conference that'll be diving into past, which is retrofits, present, which is new construction, and future, looking at next-gen materials, cutting-edge technologies, and the future of resilient climate-positive buildings. Our programs manager, Kim Davis, has assembled a really incredible roster of speakers and projects and lessons and interactive panels, and there's be great networking opportunities there as well. These online conferences that we do don't feel like your typical virtual Zoom thing. They really are a moment of community building. So we're really excited about it, and we hope that everyone will join us from all over the world for Reimagine Buildings 25 on June 12th, June 13th if you're in New Zealand or Australia. And we're excited to have Matthew Cutler Welsh as the host of the future segment of this conference. So all the more reason to join.
Definitely a global event. It's going to be great.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. And then the day after, we will be doing a special after party and debrief session in the Reimagine Buildings Collective about the Reimagine Buildings 25 conference. So the day after, we'll be doing that for members of the collective, and we'll have a panel of collective members who will be sharing some of their insights, and we'll have a nice party and conversation about what people, the big takeaways for people. So if you haven't checked out the Reimagine Buildings Collective, please do that as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jay and Mary, bringing us a great interview this week. Thank you, Zach. We'll be back again next week on Passivhaus Podcast.